There is a line, invisible to the eye but unmistakable once crossed, existing quietly inside every deeply feeling person who has spent considerable time loving someone unable or unwilling to meet that depth consistently. This line does not announce itself in advance. It does not arrive with warning signs or dramatic countdowns. It simply exists, waiting, until one day, without fanfare, without a final ultimatum delivered in anger, it gets crossed, and everything changes permanently, quietly, and completely. Today, we are going to walk through exactly what this final stage looks like, why avoidant partners fear it more than almost anything else, and why reaching it represents not coldness, but the deepest form of self-respect an empathetic person can ever achieve. Let's begin by understanding what makes an empath's patience so remarkably extensive in the first place, because this extensiveness is precisely what makes its eventual limit so significant when finally reached. Deeply empathetic people typically possess an unusual capacity to hold space for someone else's pain, their history, their fear of closeness, understanding intellectually and emotionally why certain patterns developed, even when those patterns caused genuine hurt. This capacity for understanding often translates into extended patience, a willingness to extend grace repeatedly, to interpret difficult behavior charitably, to believe genuinely in someone's capacity for growth long after evidence might suggest a less hopeful conclusion to a less empathetic observer. Let's talk about the specific stages this patience typically moves through before finally reaching its limit, because understanding this progression helps clarify why the eventual ending, when it arrives, feels so fundamentally different from earlier moments of frustration or doubt. The earliest stage typically involves genuine confusion, trying to understand confusing behavior through generous interpretation, assuming misunderstanding rather than intentional harm. This gives way gradually to a stage of active hope, believing genuinely that continued patience and understanding will eventually produce the security and consistency being sought. This stage can last considerably long, sometimes years, sustained by intermittent positive moments that continually renew hope despite an underlying pattern that remains largely unchanged. Let's talk about what follows this stage of active hope, because the progression rarely moves directly from hope into the final stage we will be discussing throughout this conversation. Typically, a middle stage emerges first, one characterized by growing exhaustion, a recognition that the effort required to maintain hope has become genuinely depleting, alongside continued reluctance to fully release that hope, despite the depletion it requires. This middle stage often involves considerable internal conflict, oscillating between moments of renewed optimism and moments of genuine despair, unable yet to settle definitively into either continued hope or genuine release. Let's talk about what finally triggers the transition from this exhausting middle stage into the final stage this discussion centers around, because this transition rarely occurs through a single dramatic event, arriving instead through a kind of cumulative exhaustion that eventually reaches genuine capacity. Something shifts internally, not through decision exactly, but through a kind of quiet recognition that continuing to extend the same patience is no longer sustainable, regardless of how much genuine care and understanding remains present underneath that recognition. This shift often surprises the empath themselves, arriving with less drama than might have been expected, given how significant the underlying change actually represents. Let's talk about what this final stage actually looks like in practice, because it deserves careful, specific description, rather than remaining an abstract concept difficult to recognize when it actually occurs. This final stage typically involves a genuine, settled acceptance that someone's capacity for consistency and emotional presence, at least currently, does not match what genuine partnership requires, accompanied by a corresponding withdrawal of the extensive emotional labor that had previously been invested in managing this gap. This withdrawal does not necessarily involve dramatic confrontation or explosive anger. It often arrives instead as a quiet, almost peaceful disengagement, energy redirected elsewhere without requiring further explanation or negotiation. Let's talk about why avoidant individuals specifically tend to fear this particular stage more significantly than almost any other possible response an empathetic partner might offer, because this fear deserves careful psychological examination. Throughout the earlier stages, hope and continued patience, avoidant individuals typically retain considerable relational leverage, secure in the knowledge that their partner's continued investment and understanding will likely persist regardless of inconsistent behavior. This security, while rarely acknowledged consciously, often allows avoidant patterns to continue relatively unchecked, protected by a partner's seemingly inexhaustible patience and generous interpretation of difficult behavior. Let's talk about what happens specifically to this security once the final stage genuinely arrives, because the disruption here proves considerably more significant than any previous fluctuation in the relationship's dynamic. The quiet withdrawal characteristic of this final stage removes something avoidant patterns have typically relied upon without full conscious awareness, a reliable source of continued emotional investment, regardless of how inconsistently that investment gets reciprocated. This removal often triggers genuine alarm, precisely because it cannot be addressed through the usual mechanisms increased intermittent warmth, vague promises of future change, temporary increased effort that previously proved reliable for restoring a partner's patient investment. Let's talk about why this particular stage proves so difficult to reverse once genuinely reached, distinguishing it from earlier moments of frustration or doubt that might have been temporarily soothed through minimal effort or reassurance. The final stage typically develops not through a single moment of hurt, but through the accumulated weight of repeated disappointment, meaning any attempt to reverse it requires considerably more than the token gestures that previously sufficed during earlier stages. Genuine reversal, if it occurs at all, requires sustained, substantial evidence of change extended over meaningful time, evidence considerably more demanding than whatever minimal effort might have restored earlier, less depleted patients. Let's talk about the specific quality of peace that often accompanies reaching this final stage, because this peace deserves acknowledgement as one of its most significant, if initially unexpected, characteristics. Rather than feeling primarily like loss or defeat, many empathetic people report something closer to relief upon finally reaching this stage, a release from the exhausting labor of constantly managing hope, constantly interpreting ambiguous behavior charitably, constantly extending emotional resources that were rarely reciprocated proportionally. This relief does not eliminate grief entirely, but it often coexists alongside grief in a way that provides genuine stability rather than continued emotional turbulence. Let's talk about what specifically distinguishes this final stage from simple coldness or an inability to continue caring, because this distinction matters enormously for understanding what has actually occurred. Reaching this stage does not require an empath to stop caring entirely. It requires simply recognizing that caring deeply about someone does not obligate indefinite tolerance of a pattern that consistently fails to honor that caring appropriately. This recognition allows continued compassion for the person's underlying struggles to coexist alongside firm boundaries around continued investment, two positions that can exist simultaneously without contradiction, despite how they might initially seem to conflict. Let's talk about what avoidant partners specifically notice once this final stage has genuinely been reached, because the shift often becomes visible even without explicit announcement. Communication patterns typically change noticeably, becoming considerably more measured, less emotionally reactive to inconsistency, less invested in seeking explanation or resolution for confusing behavior. Physical and emotional availability often reduces correspondingly, not through dramatic withdrawal, but through a kind of natural redistribution of attention toward pursuits and relationships that offer more reliable reciprocity. This visible shift often produces exactly the fear and confusion described earlier, an unfamiliar experience of watching someone whose patience once felt limitless suddenly demonstrating genuine, unmistakable limits. Let's talk about the specific attempts avoidant partners sometimes make once they recognize this final stage has been reached, because these attempts deserve careful, honest examination rather than uncritical acceptance, regardless of how compelling they might feel in the moment. This might include sudden increased communication, attempts at vulnerability previously withheld throughout the relationship, direct acknowledgement of patterns that were previously denied or minimized. These attempts, when they occur, deserve the same measured scrutiny applied throughout every stage of this discussion, evaluated not based on their initial appearance, but based on whether they represent sustained, consistent change extended over genuinely meaningful time, rather than a temporary reaction to the discomfort of losing something previously taken for granted. Let's talk about what genuine accountability would actually require at this particular stage, given how significantly more depleted the empath's patience has become compared to earlier points in the relationship. Genuine accountability here requires considerably more than acknowledgement alone. It requires demonstrated understanding of exactly how significant the accumulated impact has been, patience with continued skepticism rather than expectation of immediate trust restoration, and sustained behavioral change extended over a timeline considerably longer than whatever minimal effort might have sufficed during earlier, less depleted stages of the relationship's patience. Let's talk about what happens if this final stage, once reached, proves genuinely permanent rather than temporary, because this outcome deserves honest acknowledgement as a genuine possibility worth preparing for, rather than avoiding through continued hopeful denial. Some relationships, once this particular threshold has been crossed, simply do not recover, regardless of whatever effort eventually gets offered in response. This permanence does not indicate failure on the empath's part. It indicates simply that patience, however extensive, is not infinite, and that reaching its genuine limit represents legitimate, valid information about what the relationship can no longer sustainably provide. Let's talk about what this entire process ultimately teaches an empathetic person about their own capacity for self-protection, a capacity that may have felt genuinely uncertain or underdeveloped throughout earlier stages, characterized by extensive patience and generous interpretation of difficult behavior. Successfully reaching and honoring this final stage demonstrates, through direct lived experience rather than theoretical understanding alone, that genuine self-protection remains available even to someone whose natural inclination leans heavily toward extending compassion and patience to others. This demonstrated capacity becomes a permanent resource, available in every future relationship or circumstance requiring similar boundaries, regardless of how naturally patient or empathetic your fundamental character remains. Let's talk about the specific origins of an empath's extensive patience, because understanding where this capacity comes from clarifies why its eventual limit deserves to be honored rather than viewed with suspicion or self-doubt. Many deeply empathetic people developed this capacity through their own early experiences, sometimes learning very young that attending closely to others' emotional states, anticipating needs before they were expressed, and extending grace even when grace was not reciprocated represented a reliable way to maintain connection or safety within their own formative relationships. This means the extensive patience characteristic of empathetic people often carries deep roots, developed for genuinely protective reasons, even when it eventually produces relational patterns that no longer serve their adult well-being. Let's talk about what makes releasing this deeply rooted pattern so genuinely difficult, even once someone has consciously recognized that continued patience has stopped serving their own interests. Patterns developed early in life, particularly patterns tied to maintaining connection or safety, tend to operate considerably beneath conscious awareness, activating automatically, regardless of intellectual recognition that a different response might better serve current circumstances. This explains why so many empathetic people report knowing, intellectually, for considerable time before this final stage, that their patience has already been repeatedly tested beyond what seems reasonable, while still finding themselves unable to fully disengage until something shifts at a deeper, less consciously accessible level. Let's talk about what that deeper shift actually requires in order to occur, because this shift rarely happens through willpower or intellectual decision alone. It typically requires the body and nervous system, not just the conscious mind, to fully register that continued patience has genuinely stopped producing safety or security, a recognition that develops gradually through repeated embodied experience, rather than through a single insight or decision. This explains why the final stage often arrives with a quality of inevitability rather than deliberate choice, less like deciding to stop and more like finally fully arriving somewhere that considerable prior experience had been building toward all along. Let's talk about the specific role grief plays throughout this final stage, because grief here deserves careful, honest examination, rather than being treated as something the final stage simply resolves or eliminates. Reaching this stage does not mean grief disappears. It often means grief finally gets permission to move through its natural process without the interruption that continued hope and continued patience previously created. Extended hope, however understandable, often functions almost like a barrier against full grief, keeping loss suspended in uncertain, unresolved territory, rather than allowing it to be fully processed and eventually integrated. Let's talk about what full grief actually looks like once this final stage has permitted its natural unfolding, because this process deserves description beyond simply being named as necessary. Full grief typically involves waves of sadness that arrive unpredictably, sometimes triggered by small, seemingly insignificant reminders, alongside gradual, genuine acceptance that develops not through forced positivity, but through repeated, honest confrontation with the reality of what has actually been lost. This process takes time, considerably more time than the initial recognition that patience has reached its limit, and rushing through it in an attempt to feel resolved more quickly than genuine healing allows typically produces only temporary, unstable peace, rather than the genuine settling this final stage ultimately makes possible. Let's talk about the specific way self-identity often requires rebuilding once this final stage has been fully reached, particularly for empathetic people whose sense of self may have become significantly organized around their capacity to understand, support, and patiently accommodate a partner's difficulties. This rebuilding involves reconnecting with aspects of identity that may have been neglected during the period of extensive patience and accommodation, rediscovering interests, relationships, and sources of meaning that exist entirely independent of managing someone else's emotional patterns and limitations. Let's talk about what happens specifically to an empath's relationship with their own empathy itself throughout this process, because empathy sometimes gets unfairly blamed, treated as the source of the difficulty rather than as a genuinely valuable trait that was simply extended without adequate boundaries, rather than at its own limits. Healing from this experience does not require diminishing your empathy or becoming permanently guarded against extending genuine care to others. It requires learning to pair that empathy with equally developed self-awareness, ensuring that future compassion for others gets extended alongside continued honoring of your own genuine needs and limits, rather than at their expense. Let's talk about the specific way avoidant partners sometimes attempt to reactivate the empath's earlier, more extensive patience once they recognize this final stage has arrived. Tactics worth naming clearly so they can be recognized rather than inadvertently succeeding through their familiarity. This might include appeals to shared history, reminders of earlier good moments designed to reactivate hope that has already been consciously released. It might include accusations that the empath has changed, become cold, become someone unrecognizable compared to who they used to be, an attempt to produce guilt sufficient to reverse the boundary that has finally been established. It might include sudden crisis or apparent vulnerability, arriving with unusual timing that coincides suspiciously with the empath's newfound distance, rather than reflecting a consistent pattern of openness extended throughout the relationship. Let's talk about how to recognize these tactics for what they actually represent, without becoming either harshly cynical or naively persuaded by their surface presentation. These tactics, when they occur, typically share a common feature worth noting directly. They aim to restore the previous dynamic, rather than to build a genuinely new one based on demonstrated accountability and sustained change. Genuine repair would look different, focused not on reactivating your previous patience, but on demonstrating why renewed trust might eventually be warranted through consistent behavior extended over meaningful time. Patient with your hesitation, rather than attempting to overcome or dismiss it quickly. Let's talk about what it means to hold firm boundaries, even while these tactics are actively being deployed. Because holding firm here does not require harshness or cruelty in response. It simply requires continued clarity, continued honoring of what you have already recognized to be true about your own limits, regardless of how compelling or emotionally activating any particular tactic might feel in the moment it occurs. This firmness, maintained with continued compassion rather than anger, represents the mature expression of the final stage being described throughout this entire discussion. Let's talk about the specific way this final stage sometimes gets misunderstood by others outside the relationship. Friends or family who may not have witnessed the accumulated pattern that led to this point, potentially suggesting you are being too harsh, too quick to give up, insufficiently patient given how much you clearly still care about this person. This external judgment deserves gentle but firm resistance, recognizing that only you possess complete, accurate information about the accumulated pattern that led to this particular threshold being reached. Others witnessing only isolated moments, without full context of the extended history, cannot accurately assess whether your boundary represents premature harshness or long overdue, entirely reasonable self-protection. Let's talk about what remains true, regardless of how this specific relationship ultimately resolves following your arrival at this final stage. Your capacity for deep empathy remains a genuine strength, valuable and worth honoring, even as you learn to extend that empathy alongside firmer boundaries than you may have previously maintained. Your willingness to have extended patience for as long as you genuinely did reflects real generosity and real hope, not naivety or weakness, regardless of how the relationship ultimately unfolds from this point forward. And your capacity to eventually recognize and honor the genuine limit of that patience reflects equally significant strength, perhaps even more significant, given how difficult this particular recognition often proves for people whose natural inclination leans so heavily toward continued giving and continued understanding. Let's talk about what healthy future relationships might look like, informed by everything learned through navigating this particular experience from beginning through this final stage. Healthy future relationships would involve partners capable of matching your empathy with equivalent effort and equivalent accountability, rather than partners who simply benefit from your extensive capacity for patience and understanding, without offering proportional investment in return. This does not mean abandoning empathy as a core value moving forward. It means pairing that empathy with clearer, earlier established boundaries, informed by the hard-won wisdom of having navigated this particular pattern through to its genuine final conclusion. Let's talk about the specific timeline for healing that typically follows reaching this final stage, because expectations here deserve realistic calibration rather than unrealistic hope for immediate, complete resolution. Healing from a relationship that required this much extended patience and eventual boundary setting typically takes considerable time, often measured in months rather than weeks, sometimes longer, depending on the relationship's overall duration and depth. Patience with this healing timeline, the same quality of patience you once extended toward the relationship itself, now redirected toward your own recovery process, represents an important, often overlooked continuation of the empathy and understanding that characterized your approach throughout this entire situation. Let's talk about the specific physical sensation of finally reaching this stage, because embodied experience deserves description alongside the more psychological framing offered throughout this discussion. Many people describe a distinct bodily quality to this moment, a kind of settling, an exhale that feels different from the tension that characterized the earlier stages of extended hope and patience. This physical shift often arrives before full conscious understanding catches up to it, the body somehow registering the genuine limit before the mind has fully articulated what that limit actually means for the relationship's future. Let's talk about what it means when this physical settling coexists with continued sadness. Because these two experiences, physical relief and emotional grief, are not contradictory. despite how confusing their coexistence might initially feel. The relief reflects release from unsustainable tension, from the exhausting labor of constant hope maintenance and constant charitable interpretation of difficult behavior. The sadness reflects genuine loss, mourning for what was hoped might develop and did not, for time and emotional investment that cannot be recovered, for a version of the relationship that existed primarily in patient hope rather than in consistent, demonstrated reality. Both experiences deserve full acknowledgement, neither one canceling out or invalidating the other. Let's talk about the specific role anger plays at this particular stage, distinct from how anger might have shown up during earlier stages of the relationship. Anger arriving at this final stage often feels different in quality than earlier anger, less reactive and volatile, more settled and clear, functioning almost as confirmation of the boundary being established, rather than as an unstable, temporary emotional state requiring management or suppression. This kind of settled anger can actually support the boundary being maintained, providing useful clarity during moments when old patterns of doubt or excessive charitable interpretation might otherwise attempt to resurface. Let's talk about what specific practices might support continued groundedness throughout this final stage and the healing that follows it. Practices worth considering directly, rather than remaining abstract. Regular physical movement, providing an outlet for the nervous system energy that significant relational transitions typically generate. Consistent connection with supportive friends or family who can provide alternative sources of validation and companionship during a period when one significant source of connection has been consciously reduced or released. Professional support, whether through therapy or other structured guidance, particularly valuable given how deeply rooted the patterns underlying extended empathetic patience often prove to be, benefiting from more than self-directed reflection alone. Let's talk about what it means to eventually feel genuine gratitude for having reached this final stage. Gratitude that develops considerably later than the initial relief or grief characteristic of the stage's earliest arrival. This gratitude typically focuses not on the relationship or the person who prompted this entire journey, but on your own capacity for growth, your own demonstrated ability to eventually honor your own limits, even after extending considerable patience beyond what many people might have offered in similar circumstances. This gratitude, directed toward your own resilience and eventual self-advocacy, represents a genuinely healthy endpoint for processing this particular experience. Let's talk about the specific way this entire journey, from extensive early patience through eventual firm boundary setting, ultimately shapes your capacity for future relationships built on genuinely different foundations than the one just navigated. Having experienced directly what it costs to extend patience without adequate limits, you develop considerably sharper capacity to establish those limits earlier in future relationships, protecting yourself from repeating the same extended, depleting pattern before it accumulates to the same significant degree it did within this particular situation. Let's talk, finally, about what remains permanently yours, regardless of whatever happens with this specific relationship moving forward, whether it ends definitively, resolves into something healthier through genuine, sustained change, or continues in some altered, more boundaried form. What remains permanently yours is the demonstrated knowledge that your patience, while genuinely extensive, does have limits, and that honoring those limits when finally reached represents not failure, but genuine, hard-won strength. This knowledge, once fully internalized, becomes a permanent resource, protecting you not just within this specific situation, but within every future circumstance requiring the delicate, difficult balance between genuine compassion for others and genuine respect for your own irreplaceable well-being. Let's talk about why this particular threshold specifically frightens avoidant partners more than confrontation, more than anger, more than any dramatic expression of hurt they might have anticipated or even prepared defenses against. Confrontation and anger, however uncomfortable, still center them, still involve them directly as the focus of intense attention and emotional energy. The quiet withdrawal characteristic of this final stage removes them from that central position entirely, redirecting attention and energy toward the empath's own life in a way that confrontation, ironically, never actually accomplishes. This redirection represents a considerably more significant threat to the security avoidant patterns typically depend upon, precisely because it cannot be managed or soothed through the usual mechanisms designed to de-escalate anger or address direct confrontation. Let's talk about what this fear reveals about the underlying dynamic that existed throughout the earlier stages of the relationship. A dynamic worth naming clearly now that sufficient distance and clarity make this naming possible. Their relative comfort throughout extended patience, contrasted against genuine alarm once that patience finally reaches its limit, reveals that considerable security within the relationship depended on your continued emotional investment remaining available regardless of how inconsistently it was reciprocated. This is not a comfortable realization, but it represents important, accurate information about the actual structure of what existed. Information worth fully integrating as part of your own ongoing understanding and healing. Let's talk about what it means to hold this understanding without becoming permanently bitter or cynical about relationships more broadly, because bitterness, while an understandable temporary response, ultimately limits your own future capacity for genuine connection just as significantly as the original imbalanced dynamic did. Holding this understanding accurately, without either minimizing what occurred or allowing it to permanently color every future relationship with the same suspicion, represents the genuinely mature integration this entire process ultimately aims toward, informed caution paired with continued genuine openness to the healthier connection you genuinely deserve. And so, if you recognize yourself in any part of what has been described here, if you sense that your own patience, extended generously and repeatedly over considerable time, has finally reached or is approaching this particular final stage, I want you to trust that recognition fully. Reaching this point does not indicate failure of your empathy or your capacity for love. It indicates the natural, healthy limit of patience that was never meant to be infinite. A limit that protects your own well-being precisely because your empathy, however genuine and valuable, was never meant to come at the total expense of your own needs remaining unmet indefinitely. This final stage, quiet and undramatic as it often is, represents not the failure of your capacity to love deeply, but the deepest possible expression of finally fully loving yourself as well.